Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. I'm going to be hosting. My name is J. Stephen Roberts, and this is the third episode in our latest podcast series, the Fourth Crusade. So we have gone through the calling of the Fourth Crusade and the attack on Zara, and we have come to the siege of Constantinople. I guess technically there are two attacks on Constantinople, but that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm happy to welcome back with us for this episode one of our regulars, Dr. Helena Schrader. Dr. Schrader, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Excellent. And we also have with us our resident Byzantine history enthusiast, Mr. Joe Vicinanzo. Joe, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So we're going to jump into the offer from Alexius IV, or rather from Philip of Swabia, his brother-in-law, to divert the crusade once again, this time to Constantinople. So the offer from Alexius IV, received by the Crusaders at Zara at the close of 1202, was quite attractive. The Venetians accepted it, as did the upper leadership of the French forces. However, this caused enormous controversy in the army, and many of the rank and file were extremely uncomfortable with the idea of flagrantly disobeying the Pope's orders. More desertions followed, but a large number did agree to this diversion. And the primary reason was that the alternative, the dissolution of the army, was unthinkable to many. Now, Pope Innocent, on receiving news of the decision to advance on Constantinople, responded with an immediate bull of excommunication. Boniface of Montferrat blocked this bull from being propagated among the army, while the clergy that was traveling with the crusade appealed to the Pope on this decision. So I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Dr. Schrader. What do you think of this decision to attack Constantinople? Is there any way that this could be reconciled with the ideal of the crusade?
I don't think so. I think I've said before, I don't think this was a crusade from the time that they diverted to Zara. So, and as I say, there are legitimate strategic reasons which you hint at or have mentioned of, trying to keep the force together and make enough money to go on crusade. But that applied to Zara. I think it applies less to Constantinople. This is a pretty audacious undertaking. As I say, nobody had succeeded before. I question whether the leaders of the crusade had any idea what they were getting themselves into. But it must have been very obvious that if you're taking Constantinople, which is a huge undertaking, that you're not going to go on to Alexandria. We talked about this last time. How credible was his offer of all these troops? I don't think it's credible. I find it very hard to believe that anybody at this point really believed they were doing this for the sake of Jerusalem. I think they had allowed themselves at this point to be seduced by the idea of taking Constantinople, whether it was for the Latin Church or whether it was for their own gain.
Yeah, what do you think, Joe?
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, a very large portion of the crusading force either went home or went on to Syria or, made their way, separated themselves from the main force of the crusade to the point where it's actually primarily Venetians who ended up sailing on to Constantinople with a much smaller force of crusaders.
Yeah,
I believe that the largest portion of the actual crusader force clearly did not see that this was something that was in line with the ideals of the crusade.
Yeah, good comments from both of you. And I know later on as we get further along in the notes here, yeah, it is overwhelmingly Venetian, the force that actually does end up involving itself in the attack on Constantinople. So the Crusaders departed Zara in April of 1203 and were joined by Alexius, the son of the blinded and deposed Isaac II Angelus, at Corfu. By May, they were approaching Constantinople, passing before the sea walls and disembarking across the Bosporus on June 24th. Initially, the Venetians tried to get the citizens of Constantinople to simply proclaim Isaac's son Alexius as emperor by parading him before the city walls on a Venetian ship, but the citizens on the walls just threw rubbish at him. This is actually kind of one of my favorite parts of the whole thing. It's just kind of amusing. So Dr. Schrader, why this reaction to our young hero Alexius? Was his claim less legitimate, you think, than Alexius III, Angelus, or was
Not
it?
at all. I mean, they're both basically, this is the nephew. They're throwing it, and he is the son of the elder brother. So there's no question about legitimacy here. What's going on here is that the crowd of Constantinople, or the population of Constantinople, is notoriously fickle. They always support the winner. And as soon as they smell blood, they'll attack someone. I mean, they tear Andronicus apart. And we'll soon see as we go on here that as soon as Alexius III flees, they immediately drag out, Isaac, and they proclaim him emperor again. There's absolutely nothing particularly. This just says nothing. The other thing is people throwing objects at somebody. How many people? You have a city of, I don't even know what we're estimating. Joe, you tell me what was the population of Constantinople?
About 400 to 500,000. So
it's huge. So
they weren't all out there doing
4,000 or 5,000 people out there throwing things. That's nothing. It doesn't mean that other people weren't waiting in their homes, hoping and praying that he would come back. Not that I think that was the case. I'm just saying the evidence of the fact that you could get people on the walls throwing refuge at somebody doesn't prove what the sentiment of the majority is. Regardless, as I say, I don't think they were particularly cared one way or the other. But certainly, as long as he's outside in a boat and doesn't have control of Constantinople, I'd be mad to show any support for him. I mean, this is just self-interest. If I'm a citizen, even if I hypothesize that somebody in that city, as I say, which I think is quite unlikely, was furiously and passionately in favor of restoring young Alexis and his father, I certainly wouldn't show them that sentiment as long as Alexius III is still in control of Constantinople.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Dr. Schrader. One of the issues that we have to look at here is that there was plenty of factional struggle going on within Constantinople itself. There wasn't just one mood or one feeling about how things should go, and that has a lot to do with why there was so much change of power within the city as events were progressing outside the walls with the Venetians and the French. So, Joe, did you have any comments on that particular issue?
Well, yeah, the population of Constantinople had a lot to do with the actual appointing of emperors, in particular the religious orders and the monasteries in Constantinople were extremely influential. There's a really interesting book by Anthony Caldelis, a Greek historian or Greek-American historian, called The Byzantine Republic, where he lays out the case for the idea of Constantinople essentially continuing the old Roman tradition of the emperor is kind of like grafted on top of this large bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy keeps churning away, doing what it's going to do, and no matter who is on the top of the heap, it doesn't really change the actual operations of the state too much. But
it's not. I'm gonna object a little to the title about democracy or whatever, because this is a matter of mob rule. This isn't a matter of people coming together and reasonably debating who they think is best. This is a matter of people, coming together and getting a crowd together and whipping up sentiment and then going and plundering palaces.
There's a bit of both. And certainly later on, when the kind of the noblemen and the religious leaders in Constantinople actually did have a large meeting in the Hagia Sophia, and effectively elected a new emperor who lasted for about 2 days. The next year, there's a bit of that. There was a bit more of like the mob violence. And all that.
Yeah, the mob had a role to play in Byzantine politics, obviously, and as we kind of mentioned last time, different factions could use the mob toward their advantage, and so it's just one piece in this power struggle that tends to go on. So on July 6th, the Crusaders stormed the defense work at Galata on the opposite side of the Golden Horn, which is Constantinople's chief port. They break the harbor chain that defends it. They then marched up the Golden Horn, rounded the end of it, and camped outside Constantinople's land walls. The Venetians, meanwhile, occupy the harbor. On July 17th, there was a general assault, which failed to take the city.
The French assault fails miserably, but the Venetians actually do manage to take a number of towers along that seawall. which is hugely important, so that they get control of the towers. So this is not just as though they've an assault that's been repulsed and then the emperor flees. They actually have established a foothold, a bridgehead inside the city, and they've defended those through the day. When night falls, they're still in possession of those. That's a hugely important factor, because in fact, even if they haven't captured the entire city, they have made I'm not going to say a breach in the wall, but they've established a foothold inside the city. And that's more than a lot of any other assault had managed to do in, I don't know how many thousand. Well, what do we think?
I'd like
How
to
many
talk
years?
about this a minute.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Joe. What was that?
Oh, I just said, yeah. I would like to talk about what exactly happened there with the assault on the walls.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have some comments to add to Dr. Schrader's, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's real interesting exactly how it happened. First, the Byzantine navy was completely non-existent at this point. The Megaduke of the navy, who was Alexius III's brother-in-law, had essentially just sold off the navy over the course of the past decade in order to enrich himself. So there was absolutely no sea defense of Constantinople at the time. Now, Constantinople was protected on from the landward side by the largest system of walls in Europe, and one of the largest in the world. Certainly, had never been taken before by any of the many besieging armies. But on the seaward side, the Golden Horn, the walls it was only a single layer of walls rather than three, and there was no. And they were significantly smaller because they were expecting to be defended by the sea itself and the fleet that usually set out.
Yeah. Exactly.
And the point where the Crusaders actually assaulted was an area called the Blachernae. From the landward side, it's the only spot where there is no moat in front of the walls, and the whole quarter of the Blachernae actually kind of juts out from the regular from the city, such that from the land and the sea, it's essentially you can attack from either side, so the defenders have to go in two different directions.
Okay.
There is an imperial palace stuck up there in the Blachernae Palace,
Which one can still visit today, which is quite beautiful.
yes. But so it was a bit of a hard point. But if you were going to attack anywhere in the city, that was going to be the best spot to do it. So the defenders of Constantinople figured that the Crusaders would be the tough ones. So they've placed the Varangian Guard on the landward walls to fend off the Crusader assault, which failed miserably, as you said. But the Venetians, led by Doge Dandolo, who themselves had visited Constantinople several times in the course of their lives. A typical Venetian sailor would have been there a few times. They were familiar with the area. They assaulted directly at the sea walls, which were lower and were only defended by some light missile soldiers, archers and such. So they actually did manage to seize about 20 towers on the walls. And then when the Varangians were called from the Crusader side, from land side, to kind of push them back, which they did, the Crusaders were able to kind of slip in there. So it was just a poorly managed defense of Constantinople. So the Crusaders actually did manage to get several thousand men into the city, and they were looking pretty good for a little while, until about almost the entire defensive force, led by Alexius, the emperor himself, counterattacked, or I should say, appeared to be readying a counterattack. They didn't actually do it, though. Geoffrey de Viardouin actually talks about how this was a miracle from God that they didn't actually assault, because they would have destroyed them all. There was about 2,000 Crusaders inside the walls and about 10,000 Byzantine troops readying to assault. But instead of actually pulling the trigger and coming down on the Crusaders, as they really should have, Alexius just basically turned his men around, and they allowed the Crusaders to retreat. So never really sealed the deal. And then, of course, it was at that point that Alexius, in the middle of the night, ransacked the treasury from of 1,000 pounds of gold and fled. So
Okay, yeah.
So Joe, my question for you is: so why? Those are the bare facts, that he did pull back, and and he flees in the night. But what made him decide that it was now futile to defend his city? I mean, I don't expect you to have an answer, but speculate a little.
Yeah, I'm not sure that he actually believed that it was futile to defend the city, but I do feel like I do think it's entirely likely, probable even, that he was facing a lot of resentment among the nobility and the people of Constantinople, and he was actually more afraid of them than the Crusaders. He was certainly not a man who particularly seems to care about the defense of the city itself. He was definitely in it for the money. He had, as I mentioned, his brother-in-law had stripped the navy down to brass tacks just for to make some extra spending money for himself. And he just ransacked the treasury and left. I think that he saw where the mood of the people of the city was going and got out while he could.
Okay.
Yeah, those are really interesting comments, Joe. I appreciate that. What this whole episode strikes me as is kind of a continuation of what we've tended to see with the Angeloi anyway. This sort of plundering of the empire while carrying on these various petty civil conflicts. I do think a lot of what happens here with the Crusaders showing up at this time is they kind of were at Constantinople at the right time. Possibly a lot of previous armies who had attempted to take Constantinople could have done it in this situation when it was so poorly defended, when there's no naval defense. It kind of sounds like what you're saying, Joe, is that the Crusaders, especially the Venetians, were able to assault the walls and the defenses of the city from a point where most other armies had not been able to approach in the past. Right. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, and I do think that they themselves, it was just almost like a civil war in a sense, because the Venetians, they had their own quarter of the city.
Right.
Your typical sailor would have traveled to Constantinople several times. They were familiar with the layout of the city and the way the defensive structures were laid out.
So that was the point of just immediately breaking the harbor chain and just getting to this point that the Venetians were familiar with. So interesting. So now we're going to get to this issue of numbers. It's worth noting that by now the number of actual French participating in this enterprise was drastically reduced, as you were mentioning earlier, Joe. The strength of the Frankish contingent was now around 500 knights, 500 sergeants, and 2,000 foot. So this amounts to about 30% of the French force that had originally departed Venice.
I think that Dr. Schrader has a good point when saying that this is looking less and less like an actual crusade and more like a Venetian military adventure. Yeah, certainly after Corfu, when Boniface basically had to break down sobbing to get anyone to come with him at all, and just trying to salvage something of this whole thing. And it doesn't really. It just looks less like a crusade and more like, I don't know, payback, I guess, for the Massacre of the Latins or something.
I think it does kind of say something about how the Crusades were viewed more generally by Latin Europeans, that so many of the French refused to be involved with this. There was kind of this very strong sense of what a crusade should be, as opposed to this idea that's projected onto the Fourth Crusade by people looking at it from our own time, who will maybe want to use the Fourth Crusade as sort of an example of how really the whole thing was kind of corrupt. The whole idea of crusading was kind of corrupt. But really, the way the Fourth Crusade goes does kind of tell you something about how generally there was this feeling that, a crusade couldn't be a war against Christians.
Yeah, it's exactly it. I'm saying this wasn't a crusade. It's when they couldn't pay for the ships at Venice. It stopped being a crusade there. And the attack on Zara and the attack of Constantinople have nothing to do with crusading. The point about the numbers is that not only am I saying that as a historian looking back at it, but that the contemporaries of the Crusaders strongly felt that way. This is not, an analysis by an academic. This is the way the people living there at the time thought about it. They didn't see it as a crusade. The numbers involved are also tiny. I mean, we're not talking. It's not just that it's a third of what had gotten left Venice. We're talking, and originally, remember, not enough people came to Venice in the first place, and the crusade itself wasn't that large. 500 knights. I mean, God, Richard could pull that together for an attack on any, castle he wanted, right?
Yeah.
Henry II in his wars would have easily been able to pull together 500 knights, this is let alone the Holy Roman Emperor or Philip of France. I mean, that's just not that big a force.
Yeah, it's almost like at this point, the Venetians are sort of operating with a small mercenary force of French knights or something like that. That's really what we're looking at this point. So the leadership of the Crusade now decides to winter at Constantinople and prepare for an attack on Alexandria the following March, or officially, I guess you could say. At this point, as we said earlier, Alexius IV was on the throne now. The son of Isaac II Angelus had been crowned Alexius IV, and he needed the help of his Western allies, the Crusaders, to help him stabilize his government in the meantime, because he didn't have full control really over Constantinople. His government really was not very stable at this point. So at the same time, the clergy are also sending letters to the Pope and the kings of Europe, assuring them that they still intend to proceed to Alexandria. Alexius himself wrote to the Pope, assuring him that Constantinople was now under the Roman Catholic Church.
Which the patriarch would have had something to say about.
Right. And I'm actually not sure what the patriarch did say about that. Do you have anything on that, Joe?
Well, there was actually a debate about who was the patriarch at this point. Alexius to impose his own candidate, but the old one refused to step down. The monasteries, which, as I said, were very influential in Byzantine politics and were extremely wealthy, they flatly rejected the notion that they were now going to be under the authority of the Pope. And this definitely turned the city against Alexius right from the beginning.
Alexius, he's the emperor, and he assures the Pope that Constantinople is now under papal authority, except nobody else agrees with him on that. So the situation deteriorates rapidly at this point. The Greek clergy and population of Constantinople bitterly resent this Western presence. There are riots. Alexius could never fully gain control of his government, and he quickly was unable to make his promised payments to the Latins. The Crusaders even delivered an ultimatum to the young emperor in November of 1203. But by January of 1204, a coup broke out in the royal palace, and Alexius IV was strangled to death by a fiercely anti-Latin faction. This faction gained control of the city and raised to the throne a great-great-grandson of Alexius I Comnenus, who took the title of Alexius V, and he is nicknamed Murtzuphlus. He's kind of known to history as Murtzuphlus. Murtzuphlus cut off all ties with the Latins, who still had their main camp outside the city. Their deal in ruins and their army locked out of Constantinople, the Crusade had the funds neither to return home nor to proceed to Alexandria. In March, the Council of Leaders determined that they had one course left: the capture of Constantinople itself and the subjugation of Byzantium. So, Joe, what do you think of this? What are your thoughts at this point?
Well, there's a few things. Murtzuphlus, whose name actually means like unibrow, because apparently he had a bit of eyebrow situation going on. He had actually been involved in an attempted coup in 1201 with John Comnenus that attempted to kick out Alexius III and failed. He had actually been in prison for some time, and Alexius IV actually had got him out of prison and put him in charge of the imperial finances. And he was actually working for Alexius IV for a while, trying to get the money together to pay back the Crusaders what Alexius had promised them. But yes, as you said, these there was a lot of unrest. They did not like the idea of paying all this money to the Crusaders, the people of Constantinople, and so they got together and elected an emperor called Nicholas Canavas, who, as I said, lasted about 2 days. And Murtzuphlus was actually sent to put down the revolt. Instead, when he got there, he decided that they had a good point and basically turned around, joined them, and had Alexius strangled. Not strangled, I should say. There was debate. They tried to poison him a couple times, and they shot him with an arrow, and they might have strangled him too. Like he was actually kind of hard to kill.
Poor guy.
And then Isaac, the old blind emperor, he, according to Geoffrey, dies of a broken heart, which probably means he was stabbed in it. Uh, but yeah, so like this was a huge mess. Like they actually the people of Constantinople did not were extremely anti-Latin by this point. They actually sent out fire ships to try to destroy the Venetian fleet, which failed. And large portions of the city was burned down in rioting between the Latins and the Greeks before the Greeks were all kicked out of the Latins were all kicked out of the city by Murtzaphlus. So yeah, by March, like there was really nothing else that the Crusaders could do. They couldn't really move on. They hadn't received all the money that they had been promised and had personally, put into the investment. There were fewer of them than ever to pay back the Venetians, which the Venetians, by the way, had been handsomely paid by Alexius IV as soon as he got into power, and there was just very little left over for the Crusaders. So yeah, by this point they just figured, all right, we've got this new guy. They've killed the old emperor the emperors that we put on the throne. They've been breaking the promises that the emperor had made to us, and now it's the only way we're going to get our payback is by actually assaulting the city and taking it by force.
Good comments there, Joe. Did you have anything to add to that, Dr. Schrader? Or?
Just a couple things. A reminder that the anti-Latin sentiment had flared up in Constantinople a number of times over the centuries. I mean, we can go back to the other Crusades, but just looking at Manuel the First, etc., he had actually thrown the Venetians out in 1171 to actually placate widespread anti-Latin sentiment in the circuit. Manuel I was actually pretty pro-Latin, as I say. He married two of his nieces to Latin kings. He took part in the Crusades against Egypt. He wasn't fundamentally personally against the Latins. So he was actually responding to popular sentiment against the Latins when he threw the Venetians out in 1171. Again in 1172, there's the 1182, there's the massacres of Latin. So, this is something that's it's not all that unusual. And the bottom line is here also, Geoffrey de Villandron talks about the early months everybody being actually quite friendly with one another, which I think is also possible. But you can bet that if the Venetians had now come back and finally gotten their revenge, they were probably, enjoying that and maybe showing off that they were now and they probably aroused an awful lot of resentment that was maybe latent already. But I think that, of course, the fundamental thing is this idea of putting the church under the Latins. There's nothing riles up people so much as trying to make them change their religion. I mean, I don't know how many wars in the history of the world are about religion because people, if they believe something, they don't take kindly to somebody else telling them to believe something else or even to just worship in a different way. Religion is a much more fundamental thing than just who's king. I mean, you could ask yourself the question, would it have come at least so rapidly to a break between Alexius IV and the Crusaders or the Latins, because I don't like calling them Crusaders, if they had not tried to impose the Latin rites? We have the case of Cyprus. Richard I takes Cyprus, and he basically says, look, guys, I'm going to leave everything the way it is except you pay me instead of paying Isaac Jimenez. And everybody says, fine. And then the Templars come in and try to impose the Latin church, and they have a revolt. Mm-hmm. And then they have to go back and reconquer the island. It's just one of those things that's very, very stupid. It's politically stupid. And you wonder why Alexius IV even pretended to follow it, because, as I say, the Pope wasn't interested in taking over Constantinople. He made his point very, very clear. He didn't even want it. So why on earth would Alexius have tried to impose that? It's another one of those things. I don't understand Alexius IV. I don't know if he was playing a double. I suspect that he was only saying that because he wanted their help, but he thought he needed to say that, and that he didn't shift fast enough away from his own position. Maybe Joe has some insight on that. But those are the only 2 points I wanted to add.
Yeah, what do you think of that, Joe?
Yeah, that's very true. Obviously that resentment for a lot of things, even before the Fourth Crusade, there was a lot of resentment of the Latins among the Greeks. So it seems that Alexius, the only reason why he was actually following through with his attempt to put Constantinople under Roman authority was probably just because the only thing that was keeping him in power was the Crusader force, was the Latin force. Like, the people of the city didn't particularly want him there. He really relied on the Crusaders for his power, for almost his legitimacy even. So it's probably just to suck up to the Crusaders, not really thinking exactly about what the people of the city actually wanted.
Yeah, he was certainly a man with few options. Were you about to say something, Dr. Schrader?
I did want to point out that what Joe said about Alexius V, as I can't say his other name, had previously
I love that name.
Been in charge of the finances suggests to me that at least for him, it was seeing all that money flowing out of the city that may have been a major factor. But then again, you said he'd already he tried to revolt earlier, so that actually negates that thesis. It sounds like he was basically waiting for a chance to revolt anyways, and saw himself as a better emperor, and simply awaited his opportunity. But maybe the information he had about the treasury was something he could use to help rile up the mobs.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly possible. He might have his previous revolt against Alexius III, he had actually been doing it on behalf of a member of the Comnenus family. It may be that he just didn't like the Angeloi altogether.
Not such an unreasonable thing.
Yeah. So, as we kind of come to this big final push, the Venetians and the French, this push they make against Constantinople, I did want to mention the numbers because I think that's pretty interesting. We've already mentioned the 3,000 French fighting men. That's all that's left from the original, muster of French forces at Venice before the departure. A tiny fraction of what had originally gathered there. The Venetians had about 12,000 combatants. And in addition to this, we've got about 15,000 Latins who have been expelled from Constantinople and sought refuge in the Crusader camp. Of these, there were around 6,000 fighting men. So in all, we've got, an army of around 20,000, fairly small, and a big chunk of that is made up of Latins who had been living in Constantinople. And of course, the biggest chunk of it is Venetian. Joe, your summary about the first attack was really good. Did you want to summarize this attack now?
Well, let's see. The attack was made from the sea, almost entirely from the sea walls. They had already established that was the weak point. The Venetian ships were pretty kind of marvels of technology for the time. They had a couple hundred siege engines, ballistas and catapults and such things, including Greek fire launchers and others.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Ships themselves, the ships had castles that went up about, in some cases, 30 feet high, which is almost as high as the seawalls themselves. They could and did in several cases basically put down large walkways from the ships, for the ship castles, directly onto the walls to discharge soldiers. So the initial assault did fail. The Varangian Guard, which is about at the time about 5,000 Northern European, English, and Danish soldiers, who they were mercenaries, but they were the personal guard of the emperor, had been for several hundred years by this point. They actually put up a pretty good fight, despite the fact that they were outnumbered. But the rest of the defending force really was not so great. They were essentially, it was a very political force. The Apsikian theme in Constantinople had for a long time been essentially the place where you go to try to advance in politics, and wasn't necessarily the crack troops of the empire, because the city was considered to be basically impregnable. So with the Varangians there, the emperors hadn't really worried about an assault on the city for quite some time. So while on paper there were about 15,000 defenders of the city, it was really essentially the Varangian Guard that did all the heavy lifting. We saw in the first instance, the first assault, wherever the Varangians went, the they were able to stop up the gaps, but they had to basically be shuffled back and forth across the walls, which, miles of walls, and having people run back and forth along them is tiring in itself, and they can only be in so many places at once. So wherever the Varangians weren't, that's where the Venetians and Crusaders were actually able to establish a foothold on the walls, take towers, and kind of gradually creep along, forcing the defenders back. Not to mention that they also would use, especially the Venetians, where they would start large fires in the city, partially with the help of their siege equipment, and this caused a lot of chaos. There's smoke billowing everywhere. It's really hard to negotiate the city near the walls, because there was a lot of there's buildings built up right into the walls, built right up to the walls. Many of the streets were pretty narrow. I mean, it's a medieval town, so just lots of chaos. No one really knows what's happening. The Crusaders are assaulting several places all along the wall, all along the seawall. They can kind of sail a ship down the wall, try to shoot at almost an equal level at the walls themselves, at the defenders on the walls. So, so essentially, as things started getting pretty ugly in the city, and Murtzuphlus basically pulled the Varangians back to defend himself and cover his own retreat. So once the Varangians were pulled off the walls, it was pretty much all over. There was nothing really that the rest of the defenders could do. So over the course of this, this all occurred over the course of a day and a night.
Right.
When the defenses really came down. In fact, it got to the point where the walls were so undefended in many places that the Crusaders were actually just able to start with crowbars and things, disassembling and making holes in the walls for people to crawl through. So, just a lot of chaos.
Yeah, really interesting. So, at a certain point, it's that night of April the 12th to April the 13th that Murtzuphlus, he just makes his withdrawal and attempts to just flee. So did you have any comments about the actual assault, Dr. Schrader?
No, that was very well summarized.
Yeah,
and
that was excellent.
I still stand in awe, because I've seen those walls, but Joe's made a really good point about assaulting from the sea, and that those walls aren't as, this isn't the multiple lines of defense. And I think also really appreciate him pointing out that this wasn't, in fact, the Byzantine army in the same way that you had at earlier assaults, where everybody pulled back to defend Constantinople because they felt they were threatened.
Yeah, it's very different. This happened a long time ago, but the assault in the 7th century and the 8th century from the Arabs, it's so different. It's such a different story. In that case, you really had this unity, that you get this feeling of unity of Constantinople really. Like you're saying, Dr. Schrader, just coming together to resist this, and we don't have that at all in this case.
Yeah, even the final assault in 1453, when the Ottomans finally took the city, there was actually a smaller defensive force. It was only about 9,000 defenders, and the Ottomans had a much larger force, somewhere around 80 to 100,000 men. And the Byzantines put up such a fight in that instance. Everyone pulled together. The emperor died, in the defense, to the point where the Ottomans didn't even record the number of dead because it was so many. They didn't consider it, particularly glorious victory, and that was with the help of the largest cannon that had ever been built at that time. So it's really surprising, almost that the Constantinople went down so quickly, so relatively easily in this instance.
Yeah.
But as I think you've done a good job of explaining it. It's because people hadn't expected it. In other words, when they pull back, when they're facing the Ottomans, when they were facing the earlier assaults, they knew that they were under siege. This was Christendom under siege. Here, they've completely underestimated the Venetians. They've pushed the. They actually have. The Venetians tried to revenge the expropriations and arrests in 1171, and they're easily brushed off by the Byzantine fleet. And I think there was a great deal of complacency on the part of the Byzantine as a whole, that they just weren't going to have to. This wasn't something serious. And as you say, if what you had, most of the troops in the city weren't really the crack troops, because they were out defending the borders. then the whole balance of power begins to look somewhat different.
Right. That's very true.
Yeah, and I remember reading in Jonathan Phillips' book about the Fourth Crusade that there were a lot of people in Constantinople who were never even really aware that this was sort of a foreign force invading the city. There were a lot of people that thought it was another civil war.
Which essentially is what it became.
It was, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, it was at least but the first assault, because they were simply putting Alexius IV on the throne. So that was an internal power struggle, a dynastic struggle.
Yeah, and that
with
kind of
mercenary help.
And that kind of thing had really been pretty rampant in the empire over the past couple decades with the Angeloi. So you can see why that would be the impression that some people would get. Joe, so I know we hear this idea sometimes that in 1453, actually there was kind of this last moment of unity between the Byzantine and Latin clergy, that they sort of came together and celebrated Mass together as the city was falling. Is that true, or is that more just a
that is true? In fact, they attempted to actually launch another crusade to save the city, but it failed. Unfortunately, it never really got off the ground. It was led mostly by the Hungarians. And so in 1453 there was definitely a sense of unity. The Pope tried to call for the defense of the city as well. Yes, and even the leader of the defense, aside from Constantine XI, the last emperor, was a man, Justiniani, a Genoese general and merchant. So the Latins and the Greeks came together at that point. Certainly not at this point, though.
Yeah, that's just kind of a beautiful moment, I think, in that final catastrophe for Constantinople. You have finally these two factions that had been struggling for supremacy stopped arguing about who was going to dominate and just celebrated their common faith together. It's kind of beautiful and tragic at the same time that's ultimately what it took to sort of put that aside. But yeah, we have a very different situation here in 1204 with just this total inter-Christian conflict we've got going on here. We're kind of coming to the end of this third episode for this podcast. And next time, we're going to get into the actual sacking and destruction of the city and talk about the legacy of the Fourth Crusade, which I think that's going to be a very interesting discussion. I do want to ask the two of you if either of you have any final comments for this particular episode.
I guess the one last thing is that they had, by the time that they decided to really assault the city, take it for themselves, the Crusaders and the Venetians, or at least the French and the Venetians, had come to an agreement that they were basically going to share power, that this was going to be they were going to divvy things up. And if they would have a Venetian patriarch, they would put a patriarch who would be from Venice, and the emperor, the new emperor, would be from the Crusader force, the French force. So by this point they were kind of just fed up with dealing with the Angeloi and other Byzantine nobility, and decided that this was going to be, from now on, they're going to take control directly.
Which brings us to the point that if they're talking about taking control in Constantinople, they've given up any thought of going on to Alexandria.
I think so, yeah.
This is. I mean, the whole absurdity of this small number of people. I mean, if you're talking about 500 noblemen, 500 knights are going to rule the entire Byzantine empire. I mean, not just Constantinople. At this point, they're going to go for the jugular. They're going to put themselves up as emperors, and they're going to, with 2,000 or you say 3,000 men, rule an empire that stretches from the Balkans to Anatolia.
There wasn't that much left at this point, but yeah. But that's actually one really interesting thing about this assault on Constantinople is right before that happened, they did have these rather elaborate planning sessions where they sort of came up with how they were going to divvy up the Byzantine Empire and the government. It's almost, I mean, it's pretty cynical, but at the same time, it's also kind of an example of this Latin efficiency with government and compromise, I guess. What do you guys think?
I would say that they were definitely better at coming to quick and decisive decisions than the Byzantines were.
Yeah, but I still think it was very, very unrealistic to think they were going to, with what the forces they have, be able to dominate an empire of that size. It's I don't know if I
It's crazy.
call it naive or what you call it, but all right.
But that's what they intended to do, apparently.
They managed for 50 years, right?
Yeah, and we might kind of touch on this in the next episode. The history of the Latin Empire is remarkably dismal. This is sort of the high point, really. Is this capture of
the population of Constantinople went from 400,000 to something like 40,000. So, in that 50 years,
it's brutal. Yeah, it's horrible. Okay, well, I guess we've kind of come to the end of this. I'm really glad you two were able to talk with me about this. This was absolutely fascinating. Joe, I want to thank you for being here. It's been really good having you for this podcast because of your knowledge of Byzantine history. You've been an obvious choice for it. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and thanks. I learned a lot, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, good to know.
Definitely. And Dr. Schrader, of course, I want to thank you for being with us. It's always good to have you here.
Don't have much to add to these ones, but happy to be here.
Well, I think you've got some great comments, so I'm glad we're able to have you on. Dr. Schrader, would you go ahead and let everybody know where they can find you online?
The best place is at www.defenderofjerusalem.com because my real expertise is the Crusader kingdoms of Jerusalem, particularly at the end of the 12th century. So, and of course, the 3 books that I've published are also about that period, Knight of Jerusalem, Defender of Jerusalem itself, and the most recent book, Envoy of Jerusalem. They are all available online, both in e- and paperback format.
Absolutely, and those will be listed in the info box for this podcast. And yeah, I just want to say thanks to everybody for listening. This is Real Crusades History. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. And we will be back next Monday with the final episode of the Fourth Crusade podcast. So I'm looking forward to that. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage? A novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Please click on the link in the About box of this video to get your copy. Also, if you would like to support Real Crusades History by offering a donation, you will find a PayPal donate link in the About box of this video. Thank you.